Hi, I'm Ursula Hobson. This is the second tape I'm doing on French mats. The first one was called The Fine Art of French Matting, and in it I showed you how to roll lines onto your mat, how to apply a watercolor wash, how to paint the bevel of your mat, how to apply marbled papers, and gold foil like this. In this video we'll be continuing with French matting techniques and some other highly decorative techniques. The first technique I'll be showing you is how to apply a wash to the opening of your mat. Next, and this is probably the most complicated technique, is how to apply a wash to the perimeter of your mat. And since that is fairly difficult, I'll be showing you some easier alternatives. In this mat, I've inlaid the mat board to the outside of the mat. In this example, I've mounted paper to the outside of the mat, and then I've also speckled the entire mat to give it a softer look. This last technique, which I call a duplex mat, is not exactly a French matting technique, but it's very decorative, especially when the bevel is wrapped in marbled paper like this one has been. This is an 8-ply submat with a 2-ply top mat. I'll begin in a minute by showing you all the tools and equipment that you'll need to create all these beautiful mats. As you can see, the tools and equipment you'll be needing to create the mats that I showed you in the first section are quite basic to most frame shops. You'll need your acrylic paints and the watercolors, which I discussed in the Fine Art of French Matting. You'll also need a wide, soft brush, a thinner brush for mixing your paints. This is a glue brush which I've cut down for speckling the mats. Any kind of burnishing tool will do. You need, of course, scissors, pencils, erasers, razor blades, a cup for water, and cups for mixing your watercolors. You'll need 2 different kinds of tape. Any kind of double stick tape and drafting tape. You'll also need a triangle, a marking gauge like this one, which we used extensively in the first tape, a tacking iron, a portable hair dryer, and a dry mounting press, and you'll also need a mat cutter. I'll begin in a minute with the first technique, which is laying in the watercolor wash around the opening of the mat. Here's a sample of the technique that I'll be demonstrating in this segment. I've already rolled my lines onto the mat so that I'm ready to apply my watercolor wash. First of all, I'm going to mask off the area beyond where the wash will go. Drafting tape seems to be the best tape for this. It's strong enough to resist the watercolor, but it's also easily removed. Taping and removing the tape is fairly time-consuming, so it's actually easier just to lay in your wash between 2 lines by hand. However, it doesn't work too well. It is a lot easier to mask off the wash around the opening. Now you want to just burnish that inside edge just a little bit so that there's no chance of the watercolor flooding underneath the tape. And now we're ready to apply the wash. I've pre-mixed this paint because it'll save time. It's just watercolor. I'm using a big floppy brush. Really load it up. Start in the middle of one of the wider sides. And really flood the mat. You really have to work quickly and aggressively, being careful not to go beyond where the tape is. And just keep working all the way around. Make sure that bevel gets completely covered. And then just to make sure you have an even wash, just go around a few more times. I want to make especially sure that you got the corners well covered. And that's just about it. At this point, I like to dry the mat a little bit with a hair dryer. This keeps it from warping up in the middle. You want to keep your hairdryer at a very low setting and also keep it high off the mat. You'll probably want to dry it a little bit more than that, but for our purposes that'll be fine. Now at this point, we're ready to remove the tape. I like to use these weights to keep the mat down while I'm pulling the tape up. These I designed for hinging rice paper hinges, and they weigh about 2 pounds. It's lead shot inside a jar with a felt pad on the bottom. Now we'll be using the hairdryer again. This softens the glue on the drafting tape and makes it come off in a nice clean line without tearing the mat or tearing the lines underneath it. We'll just start heating up the mat wood a little bit. There, now that's just about done. You might want to put it in the press for just a little while to make sure that you don't have any warping at all. That's that, and now we're ready to try the next technique, which is laying the same kind of wash around the perimeter of the mat. Now I'm going to be showing you how to apply the wash to the outside of the mat. This technique is quite similar to the one we just did, but there are some differences and a few complications. We'll begin again by masking off our mat. Again, I've drawn my lines on the mat already. Of course, this time we want to tape to the inside of the lines. I'm going to start just inside the end so I don't have to trim more than one side of the tape. And again, we'll just start just inside there. This has always been one of my favorite techniques. It's really subtle and beautiful. But I always had problems with the mat board warping and the resist of the tape not being just right. So I think now that I've resolved all the problems, it is a technique that anybody can master. Now you have to trim the edges. So you want to line up a ruler and just gently score through the tape. This hasn't been burnished, so it'll come off fairly easily. And lower corner. The main problem with the outside wash is that the mat board will warp because you're applying so much watercolor. So besides blow drying it, you have to wet the back also and blow dry the back, and then it is essential on this mat to leave it in the dry mending press for a little while. Again, we want to burnish that opening. There, now we're ready to apply our wash. You want to make sure you have lots of watercolor this time because you really have to flood the mat with watercolor. We'll be using the same brush that we did on the last time, and we'll be basically going in the same direction. We'll start in the middle of the long side, paint this panel, then we'll paint this panel, and then we'll paint the opposite side, and finally we'll join the two sides at the end, and then we'll go around the whole mat one more time. You have to work really quickly in this technique, and it does take a little practice, but it is a technique that you can master if you just practice a bit. Get your watercolor mixed up well. You want to keep it really, really wet. Just keep reloading. You don't want to overload the brush. So you have to control the paint, but you want to keep a puddle going. You don't want to leave any edge of the watercolor sitting for too long because that's where you'll get a line. Come over here and get this one going. Just drag any extra watercolor around a bit. Now I want to join these last two sides. And you want to reload and go around and even up the whole wash. You can go around a couple of times if it doesn't seem even, but if you start overworking it, if it starts drying on you, then you'll have problems. There. That's going to be fine. The little inconsistencies will flatten out as it dries. Now again, you're going to want to use your hair dryer to dry the mat, and you want to use the low setting at first and then the higher setting to really dry it thoroughly. Don't get too close to the mat or you'll push the watercolor to the side and leave a tide line. Now the longer you dry that, the better it'll get and the flatter it'll stay, but a few more minutes would be fine. You really want it to be dry to the touch. We can remove the tape now. Be careful for any blobs that are left on the tape because they can get on the rest of the mat. We'll be removing the tape the same way we did the last time. go. Now you can see that was a little awkward, but you won't be able to put your weights on this mat because they would damage the wash. Now this is dry to the touch. Now next we're going to have to wet the back of the mat because it'll counterbalance the warp and it'll flatten out quite a bit better. So we'll have to clean the table off, get this old paint off of here. That'll be fine. Now we just turn this over, and this time you'll just be using the clear water. You go in the same direction you did on the front mat, but you don't have to bother to mask it all off. Just brush that on. It's just like counter mounting when you're wet mounting fabric. The stress is equalized on both sides of the mat board. This side, when you get to the part where you dry it with the hairdryer, you can turn it on high right away and just dry it for a second, and then finish drying it in the dry mounting press. Got a nice even wash there. That's enough. You just have to dry up any puddles. Now just slip it in your dry mounting press, either between blotters or between some tissue paper. Close it up. You just have it on a low temperature, about 100 degrees or so, and then just leave it in there for about 5 or 10 minutes, and it'll come out perfectly flat. And you'll be ready to do any more decorative techniques that you might want to do. On this mat, for instance, I've added a watercolor wash in this inside panel. You could also mount marbled paper or anything else to this mat that you wanted to, or you could just leave it as it was. In the next section, we'll be showing you some easier alternatives to that because it is a fairly tricky technique. The first thing I'll be showing you is how to do an inlaid mat. Here I've achieved the same effect as an outside wash by inlaying a lighter color mat board into a darker mat. And then I've decorated the whole piece with lines and marbled paper. Now most of you probably already know how to do an inlaid mat, but I'm going to show you anyway. First you want to take one sheet of backing board cut to the outside dimension. Then you want your darker outer board cut to the outside dimension and your inner lighter board approximately in ½ an inch smaller all the way around. We'll begin by cutting the outer board. We've got a 2-inch border of the darker mat and a 1 inch of the lighter mat, totaling 3 inches. So I'm going to set my guide at 2 inches and mark my mat. And you'll be cutting the opening just the way you normally do. Okay, now you want to leave your center in the mat. Remember, I've got my backing behind here, and that's what's keeping it from falling out. You want to take some double stick tape. Okay. Put a little bit around the edges. And then center this as well as you can. And press it down really well. Now, without moving the guide, we put it back in and cut it again. The two boards should be the same thickness, otherwise it won't work. Now you want to move your guide to the 3-inch width. And we just cut the opening now. There you go. There. Now we separate all these pieces and put them back together. And take the outer one off. And this should come right off. And that all falls out. These are the pieces that you don't need. Now, put your piece face up. And then that should fit in there nicely. And you can put your backing on the front now and turn that over. Now you can just take your, here it is, some acid-free tape and tape over that seam to hold it all together. I got a little bit too much there, so I'll just trim this last bit. Now, you want to make sure that you get all this double stick tape off of there. You wouldn't want to accidentally stick your customer's artwork to the mat. And the easiest way to do that, I find, is to use drafting tape. And just take a little piece and rub it over the double stick tape, and it'll peel off with it. Go. One more piece. And that's it. And just feel it and make sure you got all the little pieces. And that's done. And there we have an inlaid mat. That was one technique that's a lot easier than applying an outside wash. I'm going to show you one more in the next step where I'll be mounting a piece of paper to the outside of the mat. Here's the second alternative to doing an outside wash. In this case, I've mounted blue paper to the perimeter of the mat. Since it's especially hard to do a dark mat like this with the watercolor, this is a good alternative to that. First, of course, you'll need your white mat or your off-white mat. Here I've taken my blue paper and I've counter-mounted it with dry mounting tissue. You do this by placing it in the dry mounting press between two pieces of release paper. Now I take this and center it over the mat. Take my tacking iron and tack it along one side in the middle. Once that's adhered, you want to turn your mat over and trim the edges. You could also do this on your mat cutter on the straight cutting side. There you go. Now, you won't need this anymore. You want to take your marking gauge. This is the same one we used for marking our lines for French matting. I wanted it to show 2 1/8 inch of the blue, so I've set my marking gauge at 2 1/8 inch. You have to make the lines fairly dark since it's a blue mat. You can again set this in the mat cutter to cut this, or you can just take a ruler and trim it with a blade. Now you're simply just cutting out the opening. Okay, now the hole should just pop out. Oops. Just push it out from the bottom. There we go. Now we just put it in the dry mounting press to set the heat tissue. That'll just take a minute. It's kind of milky in consistency, and I'm going to use that to speckle the mat. Sometimes with a dark mat, like the blue mat that we have in the dry mounting press, it becomes too hard looking, and the speckling really softens it. This should be set by now. There we go. Now remember, this was a glue brush that I cut down to make the bristles shorter. You want to thoroughly load your brush and then offload it. You don't want to accidentally drip a large amount of water out. Then you just start gently speckling. Usually try to hold the brush away from the mat instead of right over it in case some watercolor would fall out of the brush. Reload it. If you do have an accident and some watercolor drops out, just blot it with a little paper towel as soon as it happens, and it should be all right. There is a bit of a trick to this, so you just have to practice a little while. Sometimes I'll take a raw umber watered down and spatter it onto a light colored mat, and it gives it an aged look, like foxing on old paper. There, that's done. Now at this point you can still add your French lines to the mat, or you can just leave it. It's quite handsome just the way it is. This is the last matting technique that I'll be demonstrating. It's called a duplex mat, and it's a 2-ply mat over a wrap bevel. It's a very versatile mat. In this case we've wrapped it in marbleized paper, but it can also be wrapped in gold paper, fabrics, or it can be left plain. In this case I've done the marbleized paper. I've cut it into 1/2-inch strips. You can get marbleized paper with adhesive backing, in which case it's very easy to wrap the bevel. This is handmade paper and it does not have the backing, so I'll show you how to mount that as well. Here's 2 strips of 8-ply ragboard that have already been wrapped. The mat board has to be cut at a bevel on your mat cutter. I just wrapped the marble paper with the double stick tape. You don't have to wrap the entire length of this strip because part of it will be underneath the top mat. Carefully place the double stick tape so that about 1/8 of an inch of it is over the top of the mat. Then you want to take it and just push it down with your thumb, wrap it around the back. And then just carefully peel the top and the bevel and leave the backing intact. That's so that when you put it down on the table, it won't stick to the table. We'll peel that last. Now you take your strip of paper. Again, we'll just stick that right over that. Oops. And do one more for you. This is how I also mount my foil that doesn't have the backing on it, and also the fabrics. I showed you how to cut the strips in the first tape, but basically you just tape your paper to a piece of backing board and then put it in the mat cutter and cut it with the mat cutter and move your guide over 1/2 inch and then just take it off the backing. Again, you want to peel that back. There we go. And get another strip of paper. This technique seems to intrigue customers more than almost any of them because it ends up so perfectly joined, and you'll see how easy it is with a special trick I have in the way I cut the mat board. And there we have it. Now I'll be moving over to the mat cutter to show you how to cut the miter on the end of these. But first we have to mark the back of these pieces with the T-square. The reason for this is that you'll be cutting this at just under a 90-degree angle. If you cut it at exactly a 90-degree angle, you sometimes have problems getting a really nice tight join right in the corner. So I found that if I cut it just slightly under, it's very easy to get that nice and tight right in that bevel there. So you want to just mark these. I've got them upside down. In other words, the bevel is sloping away from me at this point. There we go. Now we have a 90 degree, so we want to line it up just inside that. Now we'll go over to the mat cutter and cut this bevel. You can see the line is here, and we're cutting it just under a 90-degree angle. Since this mat is so thick, I'm going to go through a few times. Now remember, well, you've already marked your mat, but you have to remember that it's very important that this angle be the opposite of the angle of the bevel. That's number one. Do them all the same way. And this is the last one. That's that, and we're ready to assemble our mat. I've taken my top mat, which is 2-ply rag, and cut a square opening. Now we're ready to assemble our mat. Put this down in front of me. I'm going to take 2 pieces first. And now I'm going to turn them right side up. First you want to put a piece in that will act as a guide. So you just want to line that up with that bevel and the top mat. Here again the weights come in handy because you want to just place them on there and hold that in place for the time being. Now you're ready to attach this one. Again with the double stick tape. I'm putting that down about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. And then I'll put another piece back here. Now you want to carefully just slide that under and butt it up against the other mat the other board that's there as a guide. And you get that nice and tight, and then just line it up the length of the mat. And the first piece is in place. Now you can remove this because now this one, you'll butt the next one up to that one. Turn it. Take our short one again. You can really get a perfect corner every time when you do it this way, which is really nice. It's very uncomplicated. It's a little time consuming, but it works every time. There we go. Now we'll just slide under here and do the same thing. That's 2 sides done. Remember you have to turn it up. This happens to be 8-ply rag, but you could of course use foam core or any other thick board. The foam core tends to crush a little bit along the bevel, so you might want to put a piece of artist tape over it before you wrap it, just to give it a little more support. You can use your fingers and almost feel where that bevel lines up properly. Now we're on the last piece, and that should line up perfectly with that bevel. There's something really special about a nice deep mat. It's also great on really large mats because often you'll need the support of a thick mat. That's a perfect join. And that's that. Now all you have to do is trim the ends off of these and then turn the whole thing over. And you want to seal these seams. And also I like to tape over the edge of that paper, because there's always a little bit of double stick tape. And also the colors on marbleized paper are somewhat fugitive, so they do rub off onto the artwork. So again, you want to use your acid-free tape and just cover those seams on the back right up to the edge. And you just do that all the way around, and you're done. And I'll just show you this one again. Here I'd added the lines to the top mat. Actually, it's a good idea if you are going to French mat the top mat to French mat it before you put it all together, because occasionally the little end will be sticking out and your marking gauge won't line up properly. Once you've mastered the techniques that I've just shown you on this video, and the ones that are on the basic French matting tape, you'll be able to create a limitless number of French mats. You'll be restricted only by your imagination. To help you in designing your mats, I'm currently working on a book of French matting samples. It will include a section on color theory, a section on design, and a section on pricing, so that you'll be sure to reap the monetary rewards, as well as that wonderful feeling of satisfaction after having just completed a French mat.